Good morning, good evening, good night, wherever and whenever you are. Thank you so much for tuning in. This is episode 17 of the Subversive Liberty Podcast. Today we are going to go into President Trump's statements about the opiate epidemic. He declared it, a national health emergency this week. We're going to talk a little bit about some solutions that aren't usually discussed vis-a-vis the drug war.
Not from school, and it keeps me from believing is that liberty dies, not among outcries, but thunderous applause.
Every single day, I'm just trying to tell the world something. Will you listen? No matter what they say, time cannot move the other way.
Hello, and once again, welcome to the Subversive Liberty Podcast. I am your host, Brian Thornton, and today we're going to be talking really about the drug war, but we're going to be focusing in on Trump's big announcement this week, where he said that we're going to be treating the national opioid addiction epidemic, as a national health emergency under federal law. So a little bit about what that means, which isn't really too much at this point. There's apparently a commission that's going to be coming out, but essentially what it does allow for is for the for different federal agencies to step up their engagement and their protection of the opiate epidemic. And of course, this is not an unserious issue. I'll just start off with this kind of qualifier. Nothing that I should say in here should belittle the fact that addiction is a problem for a lot of people, that it does tear families apart, and that people's lives are ruined because of it. And in fact, the solutions that I'm going to touch upon here and probably expound upon in work, in writings, and of course this has been an issue that's been talked about for a long time. And in fact, I'll get into it in a little bit, but this has been talked about for as long as the war on drugs has been around, under Nixon, that is to say, and even before that. There's never been a clear solution there's never been a clear answer, certainly not a scientific one, that the answers that we have chosen, and by we, I mean past governments of the United States and continued on through the governments of today, that the means that they choose, that is to say criminal justice, punishment, creating black markets, making these substances illegal, is actually the best course of action for it. So let's start here with the question, what is a drug? I guess I should have pulled this up beforehand, but we'll do a quick little diction of what a drug is. And I mean, basically some sort of chemical that alters your mental state in one form or another. And of course, when we talk about drugs, we usually focus on the quote-unquote illegal ones, the quote-unquote dangerous ones. Most people tended to grow up, if you probably, in the States, you probably had some kind of a DARE program where they talk about how drugs are bad, okay, like Mr. Mackey from South Park. A medicine, here's the definition: a medicine or other substance which has a physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body. Of course, this is a very general definition, and there are plenty of drugs that people accept as being helpful, and rightly so, including, by the way, the drugs that are so maligned and also so addictive and so destructive to people's families. So a drug is more than just what is illegal. A drug encompasses a lot of things. And what's very interesting, too, when we're getting on, so we're really, if we want to bear down, we're talking about drugs used recreationally or drugs used socially. And as a matter of definition, I think I always like to start the conversation by connecting alcohol with drugs, because usually when it's referred to in popular media formats and the way that it's referred to, certainly in the case of law, is that drugs and alcohol are two separate entities. But in fact, alcohol is a drug. It's a medicine or other substance that has a physiological effect when ingested or otherwise introduced into the body. We all know this. Most people have gotten drunk, and unless you're one of those people who is fortunate enough to not have some sort of a caffeine addiction, you know this in the morning that you need your caffeine to get you going. I'm certainly somebody like this. I am a horrible person without my morning cup of tea, or if I'm lucky, Cuban coffee. So drugs encompass a large swatch of the population, and in fact, there are many drugs that are completely decriminalized and completely legalized. And while there are problems associated with that, such as smoking, such as alcohol abuse, we don't see the government locking people in cages anymore because of it. I say anymore Because if we go back to the beginning of the century, we of course have the temperance movement in American politics. And the temperance movement wasn't exactly aligned, but it was somewhat aligned with progressive policies. So there's certainly an interplay there that the libertarian critique can offer to people. There's, I'm sure, good books about that. One book I always recommend about the progressive era is Illiberal Reformers. And the way it connects, at least with the drug problem, is that people say, okay, well, there are these people, and these men drink a lot, and then they go home and they might beat their wives, or maybe they spend all their money gambling, or maybe they spend all their money on alcohol, and there's no money left for the family. This is a common thing that exists to today. When we talk about the developing world, when we talk about the current world today, there's still problems with alcoholism, even though it's completely legalized, because of course it's about the person. It's not about the drug. And I think in a lot of ways, we've started to come, at least scientifically, and this has been held back in a lot of ways by government policy. We've started to scientifically understand the nature of addiction and understand that it has a little bit more to do with than just simply giving somebody a drug. There are other factors that go into whether or not somebody is going to become addicted to a drug and become addicted to the point that it's going to negatively impact their life. Because, of course, that's really what people are concerned about. And it may sound callous to say, but it's not. It's just a fact. You may not like that somebody in your family smokes cigarettes. You may not like that somebody in your family uses vapor products, for example, or likes to smoke marijuana or likes to drink. But where it becomes a problem, and certainly becomes a problem, again, quote unquote, for society, is when that begins to interfere with your daily life and disenables you to actively participate, whether that means as a job, whether that means you're being a belligerent, you're getting into fights, you're destroying property, so on and so forth. And of course, these are issues, and in some instances, and such is the case with property damage, there may be a role for some sort of criminal justice reform. But one thing that the Nixon administration really brought into power was the war on drugs. This was a big issue for Nixon, and if you were looking for a little bit more of an in-depth, I would really recommend Historical Controversies, put out by the Mises Institute. I will link to it on this episode because he does a much better job than I will getting into the history and backing it up with sourcing. I really just wanted to kind of do a basic overview today and talk about the way I view the drug war and why I view it as such an important issue. So I outlined a few weeks ago in a piece that I wrote about, really it was about Trump's Twitter, but in there I put 3 basic issues, and really it's only 2 if you think about it. I talk about the problems of the foreign wars, the domestic wars, and then our monetary policy, that is to say the debt, the national debt, and our current fiat money system. I see these as the major issues that someone who identifies as a libertarian should be focusing on, and then more importantly that all Americans should really come to terms with, because in my estimation, the way that I view things, the way that I've come to things, I think that there are some serious problems in the way that we treat them. And especially with the drug war, I think most people have come to realize that they've been misled in one form or another. And this has in large part to do with the success of medical marijuana and recreational marijuana. Colorado is seeing a boon because of it. Drunk driving is down. There are fewer accident-related deaths according to alcohol. There's also a lowering of heroin use, if I'm not mistaken. And while there is still a black market available, there have been large strides to actually combat the problem of drugs. We don't need to look very far, and we don't need to look very hard to discover that people have been sounding the alarm that the current policy in the U.S., the war on drugs, treating this as a criminal justice issue. That is to say, believing that the drug user and the drug dealer are engaged in some kind of immoral, illicit transaction that should not have the benefits and protections of government. Now, of course, I've already touched upon the fact that this is not the case for all drugs. And in fact, there are many drugs that are given out as life-saving, and there are many drugs given out in a life-saving format, including opiates. But then there are also drugs that are allowed to be consumed recreationally, such as nicotine, alcohol, caffeine, and then in some cases now marijuana within the United States. But we can go all the way back to we can go all the way back to the Nixon administration, because of course the big commission that they found on whether or not that was supposed to solidify the fact that marijuana should remain illegal and remain such a highly scheduled drug was overturned by pretty much every commission, every scientific inquiry that was ever looked into it, and this was swept under the rug. Why? Because it was politically profitable for the Nixon administration, for other politicians to be tough on crime and tough on drugs. And this creates some really bad feedback loops. This creates some really bad incentive structures that have now gone on for 40, 50 years at this point, that have completely destroyed multiple generations of people by criminalizing this behavior, that have enabled cartels and gangs to have such a stranglehold over the people, over certain areas of territory. Because that's really what happens in the war on drugs, right? Nothing that the government has ever been able to do has actually stopped people from wanting to get a product that they desire. The laws of economics stand. They do not disappear just because a government bureaucrat whisks their wand and says, if you do this, we're going to throw you in a cage. What you do, and this is a very standard analysis, somebody like Milton Friedman talked about this constantly. What you do when you push things to a black market is all you're doing, you're giving the cartels business. Because logically speaking, if there are people who demand a product and there are people willing to supply said product, so long as the government doesn't get in the way, those people will get their supply, the suppliers will get paid, and in turn they'll be able to invest and create better products at a lower cost, more safely, so on and so forth. And again, we've seen this with marijuana. Now, most people today, actually no, let's go back. So the science has always been on the side of people who want to decriminalize drugs. And of course, there were many doctors who wanted to decriminalize drugs during the turn of the century, and or refused to, or disagreed with the idea of criminalizing them to begin with, because really we don't see this until the creation of the progressive era. We don't see this until the administrative state. We don't see this until it was renegotiated, the relationship between citizen, so to speak, and the individual and the state was reactualized, reorganized, usurped, whatever words you want to use, where we took the position, again, by we, I mean past governments and continued governments to today. This is a position I disagree with, that the role of the state is to be involved in every single aspect of the citizens' lives to make sure that that citizen is a productive member of society, and that therefore they are a good tax base, more or less. Because if somebody's strung out on drugs, they're not really going to be able to work, and if somebody's not going to be able to work, well, then they're not contributing to society, which means to say they're not paying taxes. And by the way, I don't think many people actually want to be hopelessly addicted to drugs. Of course, things like nicotine and caffeine are addictions that are maybe problematic and troublesome for some people. And in fact, there are a lot of treatment options available to people, especially with alcohol and alcohol addiction. We also see this. And so it doesn't stand to reason that if we allowed all drugs to be at least decriminalized. Now, the official libertarian position and my position would be to legalize all drugs. Of course, that would cause a massive shakeup in not only the criminal justice world, because most of the most police interactions, they try and elevate things into drug crimes. That's why the cops are always going to try and search your car. That's why they're always going to ask you if you have any marijuana in the car. They are trained to escalate anything into a drug charge. Why? Because drug crimes are very lucrative. It's very easy to prove fault. It's very easy to arrest people for it because the substance is right there. And so from a criminal justice issue, I start to see a problem here, because under a libertarian axiomatic claim of non-aggression, that is to say, you shouldn't aggress upon other people's property unnecessarily. It is not at all within the government purview to decide what somebody puts into their body until it becomes an issue with somebody else's property or somebody else's person. That is to say, if you are actually going out and harming people because of the drugs that you are consuming, which happens very rarely, and of course make for great sensational stories. And I don't discount that there are many drugs that people maybe shouldn't try and shouldn't use. But if we allowed for them to be available on the open market, on a regular market, and just let people naturally and peacefully engage in transactions, I don't think you would see as big of a problem with specifically opiates today. And obviously that's been the focus that a lot of the media wants to talk about. I was actually watching a New York Times, and not once did they mention the idea of decriminalization. Of course, I'm sure they've written about how, and in fact, I know they've written about how marijuana is actually used to reduce opiate addiction because it provides a lot of the same benefits without the same addictive properties of it. But even more than that, we've seen the case study is Portugal, right? Portugal, I think almost 20 years ago now, decriminalized all drugs and has not had a single heroin overdose left. And really, again, if we're gonna narrow in on what actually hurts people and what actually is the worst outcome of drug use, because I've already established that you can have some kind of a drug addiction without it being a real problem, and more importantly, that you can that people who have addictive personalities and who have addiction that runs their family, usually there are other psychological factors at play. It's really Portugal was the case study, and Portugal was the one who came together and said, okay, we're going to change this and we're going to take a completely different approach. Sweden has also adopted this. So there have been other countries. These are generally regarded as developed countries. These are Western European countries, very similar to the United States in regards to a lot of things, except they've taken the better approach, the different approach. And this is never talked about in standard American doctrine. And I think this has to do with a lot of reasons. Number one, the economic incentive. So I kind of mentioned it before, but one of my favorite Milton Friedman quotes, and I do mention it a lot, and you'll forgive me because I do consider this to be one of the most serious issues of our time, is that from a purely economic perspective, the role of the federal government in the war on drugs is to keep the cartels and the gangs in business. The cartels do not exist. The gangs do not exist in some sort of objective reality that they must occur and that they must happen within these neighborhoods among these people, as some others would claim. It's not the case. In fact, we see very clearly, just looking at American history, looking at the Prohibition movement and the way that the temperance movement negatively affected the country. We saw the rise of the mafia and other street gangs like Al Capone, who is, of course, a famous gangster, during Prohibition, during the fact that this was a service, this was a product that people wanted and did not like the fact that the government was telling them not to. And you know what? This is aside from the fact of whether or not it is good to consume drugs, or whether it is good to drink to excess, or to consume any kind of mind-altering substance. Libertarianism per se and a proper government policy per se says nothing on the matter. Your personal ethics, your family history, your traditional, your culture, whatever culture you identify with, is going to change and inform these opinions on you. And then maybe when you interact with people who have a differing view, you take that on for yourself. So this is not the position is not actually to say that, drugs are bad or drugs are great and everybody should try them. I guess you would probably find me a little bit more in the middle on that issue, where I don't really see a problem with most drugs. And I certainly don't think that it should be the role. I certainly don't think that we should be locking people up for a criminal justice issue of what is, as most people properly refer to it now, as some kind of public health issue. That this is an issue that shouldn't be handled by police officers. And if we're going to talk about incentives and the way that people spend their time and the order of value that people ascribe to things, again, as I already stated, it's very easy to lock somebody up. It's very easy to charge somebody with a drug offense because they have some pot on them, they have a little bit of blow, they have a little bit of H. Okay, here's the substance. I get to take the substance, or I get to plant the substance, or I get to use a drug dog to do a false positive single, which happens. And from there, I get to then charge the person. The law is very clear. And then we have mandatory minimums. That mean this person's going to jail for years, which means they come out as a felon. And that means that they can't properly reintegrate into society. And so this very clearly connects with many issues. And more than that is the billions of dollars that's spent by governments. I think the DEA's budget for 2016 was just over $2 billion. That's $2 billion for people to be paid to essentially go after traffickers, go after users, go after dealers for what could be just a normal transaction that occurs between a party, between you and your local dispensary, like what happens in Colorado every single day, what's happened in California for years. It's a very tough issue for me because it's something that I think people get very emotional about, especially if you have somebody who's suffered from addiction within your family. And while I've been fortunate that it hasn't directly affected me, I certainly understand that for many people, drugs do become a problem, and that alcohol becomes a problem. And alcohol is, of course, a drug, as I've already stated. It's up to the individual. This is, again, where we can very easily see why treating people as individuals, not as groups and classes, that classifications of different kinds of people comes into play. Because we might understand that some people are more inclined to addictive personalities, but if we can actually educate on that beforehand, and then more importantly, not require them to go underground to get it, we would see huge solutions pretty much overnight. How could it be overnight, Brian? Well, because places have used this consistently, successfully, especially when it comes to opiate addiction. So decriminalization, at least, is the name of the game for most people, and I think that would be a good policy for the government to take. I want to talk about, the last thing I wanted to talk about was to connect this to, again, I view this as one of the most important issues of the day. I view our foreign wars, our domestic wars, and our monetary policy as the three most important issues that everybody should be given attention to. And I think the one that gives me the most hope, at least in the short term, are the domestic wars, specifically the war on drugs, because I think so many people have actually moved on this issue because of the success, because of the internet in large regard, and because of the success of recreational efforts, of legalization efforts in different states and decriminalization efforts in different states throughout the country, usurping, nullifying the federal government, which is one of the roles of the states. The war on drugs is horribly unjust. It sets up an entire criminal justice system that takes money from people, because this connects to civil asset forfeiture, in which more money last year, you can look this up, it's very easy to find, more money last year was taken from people through civil asset forfeiture, at least according, I think, to the FBI statistics, which of course are not perfect and not all encompassing, but the point still stands. More money was taken from people in civil asset forfeiture than was taken through actual property crime last year. And the civil asset forfeiture is almost entirely promulgated by the war on drugs. This is where, in fact, it was passed specifically for dealing with drug traffickers. This is why banks have to tell the government if people are sending too much money or taking out too much cash at any one time or depositing too much cash into their business. And again, if we're going to take what I would view to be a proper relationship between the role of the state and the role of the individual, this is entirely contrary to the idea of liberty. And again, this doesn't mean that you have to like the fact that people want to use psychedelics, let's say, or even, let's say, marijuana, which is an entirely harmless substance, and frankly has been shown consistently, and I believe will be shown to be more so in the future. Sorry, that was a little complicated. What I'm trying to say is that it's safer than alcohol, and its effects are less severe than alcohol, and people don't tend to take as many stupid decisions as they are on alcohol. But the reason why, I think, beyond just general ignorance that tends to occur at some of the highest levels of government, has to do with special interests. And again, I've already stated, we have over $2 billion. There are thousands of people, probably more, employed by the DEA. These are people, mind you, who will spend government money on, parties with strippers and doing plenty of drugs themselves, hanging out with drug dealers, and and doing really bad things, and again, entrapping people, running stings, getting people to locking people in cages, again, for doing nothing more than wanting to enjoy the substance of their choice, to relax in the way that they want to relax. And it shouldn't be, again, it should not be the role of the government. It should be the role of civil society, whatever your local customs are, whatever your culture says, whatever your religion says. If you agree with it, those should be the people that would provide any sort of stops, not the government, because all the government can do is use men with guns and women with guns. I'll be egalitarian in that matter. Use people with guns to put you in a cage and to fine you and to take your money. That is all they do. Now, we might have some sort of drug retreatment plan that the government also sponsors, and of course, those are better than locking people up. But again, the resources would be better allocated if they weren't done through centralized means of taxation and done instead through charity. There's a couple more points I want to touch on here before I move into the idea of this being a political football, and this is why you have to watch out for the way politicians speak about things and why it's so important to recognize politics for what it is and look then for people who are willing to stand against what politics per se and politics as it exists today go in at. And that is this idea. And this was something that during the presidential campaign, Gary Johnson did a horrible job of speaking on, which is sad because this is usually an issue that he does that he did fairly well on, as evidenced by the fact that he looks like he's stoned out of his mind most of the time. And look, I have no problems with that, really don't. Just when you're trying to make national TV and national bring yourself, bring your party, bring your ideas to national prominence. That's where I take issue with it. But it's what happens when you push things onto a black market. Because there are very clear things that tend to happen, especially in regards to drugs, as this occurs. It leads to a destandardization. So right now, I can go to any Best Buy, any Target, really any store. I can go to a 7-Eleven and buy a new charger for my phone. Well, maybe not my phone because my phone is USB-C and that's not as popular yet. But the fact of the matter is, you could go to most gas stations, pretty much anywhere you could think of, and buy a charging port and a cable for any Android device or any iPhone device. And that's pretty easy to do. Why? Because the market is pretty much market demands have basically established, and and Google has helped out a lot of this with the Android operating system, that there's basically only two kind of chargers that you need: micro USB turning into USB-C, and then the 16-pin iPhone charger, which, remember when that was a big deal when that changed? And this, I don't have to worry. I can even buy stuff off of websites like Fast Tech and Alibaba direct from China at a much lower cost. Wait a couple weeks for them to be delivered, but they can still, but they still come. And they'll come to me. They'll be used. They might not. There are some that are good. There are some that are bad. You got to look for the right pieces inside. But the point being, I don't have to worry about them exploding, by and large. Sometimes it happens, but of course, by and large, you don't have to worry about those things. Same thing with food. I can go into any supermarket in the United States and get an apple. I can get an orange. I don't have to worry about the I don't have to worry about the apple having worms in it. I don't have to worry about the orange being poisonous. What market forces allow for, and this is another issue entirely, but it's not strictly because of the FDA that these things occur, because what good businessman wants to poison his clients or her clients? None is the proper answer to that. But where I don't get that, and in tobacco, let's keep going. Let's move now into drugs. With alcohol, during Prohibition, we know that if alcohol isn't brewed properly, it can cause you to go blind in some cases. It can really harm your body, harm your esophagus, dissolve, parts of your throat or whatever. And we saw this in Prohibition, and we see it sometimes with people who try moonshine today and try to make it and don't make it properly. And again, market forces allow for a standardization to make things safer and to make things easier to gain access to and easier to gain information about. So I can go and grab any beer and I don't have to worry about it poisoning me. I can go buy a bottle of wine, and as long as I buy a decently priced one, I don't have to worry about a ton of sulfides that are going to give me a massive hangover the next day. And in fact, there are inventions that can help remove sulfides from wine, which is kind of cool. And all of these things are allowed to happen because the government doesn't get in the way, and the government does not say, hey, if you engage in this practice, any money you make can be taken from you at any point in time. And more importantly, if we catch you doing it, we have the ability to throw you in a cage, ruin your life, and not care about you afterwards because it's your fault. You broke the law, and the law should stand. And of course, I don't really agree that you should use the law as a strict basic for your ethics. I would prefer law to reflect ethics, but of course, in many cases, especially in this case of the drug war, it does not. So this is a political football. And if you haven't read my piece on it, I would recommend you do so, and let me know what you think, because this is something that I've kind of been working on, something that I've kind of been trying to push out as, I don't know if I strictly coined the term, but it's certainly a term that I'd see put out there often, and at least put out there in such a systematic form. So a political football, at least for me, any policy position or any policy or cultural issue that politicians, irrespective of party, use to rally their base into actions, see donations or votes. The gravity of the underlying issue notwithstanding, it is my contention that for the politician, playing with political footballs enable them to win, not by solving the issue, mind you, but by ensuring their reelection. Drug abuse is a serious problem. The problem with opiates in our society is a serious problem. This is a very serious issue that politicians like to play with, because very few of them, if any, offer any real reform. That is to say, ending the drug war. That is to say, abolishing the Drug Enforcement Agency. That is to say, ending civil asset forfeiture as a solution. And I think the biggest reason why is because there's a ton of money that comes from this. I really do think it's that simple. It is that simple of a bad economic incentive that the government has created and that the government has used to now hurt people. And hurt people for multiple generations. Again, we talk about this all the time. This was something that Obama talked about on the campaign trail and certainly talked about as a community organizer. But once he got into office, he didn't really care anymore about that. Just like he didn't really care about being open and transparent, and didn't care about closing Guantanamo or really ending the wars. Considering as soon as we started to try to end one, he just got into a couple of more, and we're still fighting them. But this is about the domestic wars. This is about the drug war. And the drug war is perhaps one of the biggest political footballs, because I would argue at least most of the Democratic Party, again, they're supposed to pay lip service to this idea of civil liberties, and there are massive injustices. I think, who's the rising star in the Democratic Senate? Kamala Harris, forgive me if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. She came to prominence over some of these interviews, and she's a lawyer, and she's a very, very good, you can definitely tell she was a good prosecutor and a good lawyer, because she's very good at needling in on what people say and holding their words against them. And she had a pretty contentious back and forth with Jeff Sessions a couple months back, and she's definitely somebody that people are talking about on the Democratic side. And I remember there's a now this that's circling around pretty regularly, and she's like, we're going to reform criminal justice and we're going to fix things. And her solution is fixing bail bonds. Again, not decriminalizing, not legalization, which is really what the option is. There is no partial fix. There is no actually fixing the opiate epidemic until we start removing drugs from the area of criminal justice and start moving them back into the care of doctors and caretakers. People who are compassionate, who are empathetic, and more importantly, are educated on the issue, educated on the physiological effects, the chemical effects, and not concerned with, again, taking money from people and putting them into cages. Because that's what the police do. And what the police should be focusing on is taking people who are actually harming other people, who are harming people's life, liberty, and property. That should be the focus of it, not going after nonviolent drug offenses. Possession should not be a crime. Distribution should not be a crime. This should be allowed to be used as a legal business for any drug that there is a market demand for. And I know this is a complicated issue. I know people are probably listening to this like, oh God, well, I can deal with heroin, or I can deal with heroin. I can deal with marijuana. Most people will say this to me. This is usually what comes up if you get into if I get into a conversation of this. Well, we can legalize marijuana, and fine, let's start there. I'm perfectly comfortable with starting there, as long as we also decriminalize all the other drugs. Because what we've done, again, has created a horrible system in which people are locked up, have their lives ruined, all for trying to enjoy a substance that they'll probably grow out of, because a lot of people try it and don't like to continue using it. Some people do. Some people prefer it to alcohol. Some people prefer alcohol. I'm not really concerned with your personal choices. All I think is that you are responsible for your choices. So, of course, if you're going to drink and you're going to get behind the wheel of a car and you crash into something, that I think that is a horribly unethical thing, especially in this era of Uber and Lyft, where you can take a ride anywhere at any point in time very easily, relatively cheaply, and certainly better than accidentally killing somebody. And of course, that doesn't really happen as much with marijuana. You don't see the same effects on driving and marijuana usage. And it's just fascinating to me that we're still having this conversation. And I really think it goes to show. I really think in a lot of ways, that this is the linchpin, especially because they use it as a political football. So again, Democrats care about this from a civil liberties standpoint. They want to help the black communities in places like Chicago, which of course they really don't. They just want their votes. But they want to help the community and make it so that people aren't turned into criminals at a young age. Well, it's very simple. Just stop making this a crime. This shouldn't be a crime. This should be an individual decision that people make. And it shouldn't be, and yeah, maybe that means you actually, as a parent, you have to have a conversation with your child that they should stay away from these substances because they have addiction that runs in their family and it's a problem. And maybe that will still mean that some people get addicted. But punishing people doesn't change that. That's never stopped anybody from trying a drug. And in fact, it just makes it more dangerous. And more importantly, it's easier probably. And think, you hear this rhetorically a lot, but it stands true. It's easier for people who are under 18, let's say, because 18 tends to be regarded as the age of adulthood. You can buy, we should lower the drinking age too, because then there's the whole binge drinking atmosphere that's arisen on college campuses. And that's certainly something that I didn't pay much attention to when I was younger, but now that I'm a little bit older, when I was 18 and I was excited that I could drink at parties and everything. And it wasn't something that I thought a lot about then, but it is something that I've thought about since, as my drinking habits have changed, and as I actively cut back on how much I thought was the acceptable amount to consume. And a lot of it came from the fact that I couldn't just go and buy what I wanted from the store, and so I had to drink whatever was at a party, and I had to drink a lot of it because, again, that's just the incentive structure that's put into place when you make something illegal. When you make it illegal for people to purchase it or to consume it at a younger age. And the same goes for these other so-called illicit substances, these other recreational substances that people choose to take or choose not to take at their own volition. And it would be better if there was a place like a bar, like a liquor store, where the individual property owner is also responsible for the fact of what they put out there. And you don't serve a drunk guy at a bar. That's a bad idea. Most bartenders aren't allowed to do that. And you also have, there's a lot that goes into this issue. There's so much emotion. There's so many problems with the way that we've been taught and a lot of the, frankly, blatant propaganda that's taught about drug use and the way that drugs affect people and the way, and the way that they, and the way that people interact with them and what actually causes addiction. And of course, the science can't catch up to the policy because the policy is holding the science back by years. And this is what frustrates me when we start to get into these issues because, again, neither of the main parties are really looking into these. And I also don't see a lot of libertarians that are in positions, most libertarians will talk about, yeah, bro, let's legalize weed, right? That's kind of always been, that's what I think Ann Coulter and Ayn Rand shared this, that they hated libertarians because we were just about legalizing weed, and we're not just about legalizing weed, but that's certainly an important issue, and it really does interplay. It interplays on health, on medicine, criminal justice, the proper crimes that we should be going after. So there are more. It makes it easier for them to go after those because these are metrics that they can track, and so it makes it it disincentivizes them for going after violent offenses because they can go after nonviolent offenses a lot more easily, excuse me. And so hopefully you guys have enjoyed this episode. I'm going to end it there. I just wanted to really just rant about it for a little bit, get my thoughts together. I should be putting out an article that's a little bit more in depth, a little bit more researched, a little bit more cited in regards to this. I really hope you guys are enjoying some of the new episodes. Let me know what you thought about my interview with John Mathey. Let me know what you thought about my conversation about skepticism that I had for episode 14. Hopefully going to be interviewing a couple of more politicians here in Illinois who are running as libertarians. It should be a lot of fun. And yeah, guys, so don't forget, if we fear what we do not understand, the answer must be to try to understand everything. So I hope you have a good morning, a good evening, and good night.
From school, and it keeps me from believing is that liberty dies not among outcries, but thunderous applause.